Well, Christopher, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, Christopher. You're somebody that we really wanted to have back. And I know that we talked about astrology in quite some detail last time, but we're all poised to hear what you have to share with us about tarot. And really, Christopher, my first question on tarot is if you could tell us what you know about the beginnings or origins of tarot.
Well, Stephen, that may take all evening, but I'll certainly start with that, and you can stop me at any point. We probably need to best start with the word. Tarot entered English from the French. However, it comes from the Italian tarocchi, and that is plural for tarocco, which is of unknown origin. The other thing that the tarot cards were called in Italian were trionfi, or triumphs, which translated into English as trumps, which is a word we still hear in card playing today. Now, there is a lot of confusion around the origins of the tarot. So there are folkloric interpretations. There are also interpretations that follow a history or a paper trail. And one of the folkloric traditions, and I'll talk about this also a little bit later, is out of the Brotherhood of Light tradition. It was believed that the tarot images were the bas reliefs in a initiatory temple, and that initiates were brought before these as part of their induction and taught specific lessons about them. Though tracing that along the lines of history or paper trail is difficult. That's something that really doesn't pop up until the 18th century. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of tarot from what we know historically, and where this becomes a little confusing is that it appears that tarot cards were actually a combination of two different decks. The oldest playing cards that have been found were discovered in 1939 by Leo R.A. Meyer, who was a professor of archaeology and Islamic art at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he was at the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, where he discovered this either 12th or 13th century deck of cards with recognizable symbols on them. Now, as far as we know, cards came into Europe through the possibility of one or two pathways, either through the European contact with the Near East during the Crusades, or more than likely, playing cards, especially Islamic playing cards, came into Spain during the 800 years of Islamic rule there. Now, the Tarot Arcanum, the Trionfi, as the Italians called them, appear to have come in later, and the oldest examples of them date from late medieval to early Renaissance period, and the oldest examples show up in northern Italy, around the areas of Florence and Ferrara, where these were being designed. And somewhere along the lines, these triumphs, these tarocchi, became combined with the decks of playing cards, which were 56 in number, and the 22 major arcanum became added to that, creating a 78 card deck. So that is the history of this. Now, I mentioned that in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, this was believed to be the images tied in with initiation. And this comes from actually a document that appears in Europe in the late 18th century, around the 1780s. And the author of this is uncertain. It was attributed to Iamblichus, who was a Neoplatonist of the 5th century. And he did write on the mysteries and initiation, though this particular document does not necessarily follow his style, but it comes out of a European tradition at that time of what was Egyptian, Rosicrucian, and Freemasonic traditions. And so this document appears, which within the decade, anyone who has ever seen Mozart's Magic Flute Opera, this particular document was being translated into a libretto and a whole opera that walked one through Egyptian initiation. And the symbols of the tarot cards were assigned to those different stages. That portion is not in Mozart's opera. So there's so much more we could talk about in terms of history, but there may be other topics you want to touch on tonight.
There are lots, Christopher, because I know you have so much knowledge. I want to ask you firstly about the fact that the suits are different in the Church of Light or the Brotherhood of Light Egyptian tarot system. So my understanding is that ordinarily pentacles represent materialism and earthly matters, and swords represent air or the intellect. But that's not the case in the Egyptian tarot of the Brotherhood of Light, if I'm correct in my thinking.
Yes, and I think one of the important things to say here, to sort of preface this, is that there are many different systems out there. Now, in the last century, there were only a couple of systems that were being practiced, and primarily they were divided either into the Hermetic system, the Brotherhood of Light, or the Golden Dawn tradition, which comes out of the A.E. Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith tarot cards. So those are the two greatest differences. I'm of the opinion that when you go to study cards, it's good to pick a system and become thoroughly immersed in that, because it trains you in the philosophy of that system. So in the Brotherhood of Light system, coins represent the element of air. For example, we can probably go, some of us, for maybe 40 days without food, can't really survive 3 days without water, and no more than 10 minutes without air. So air was considered to be the most vital life force or substance. Coins became the symbol for that as being the most valued substance, and that became later in tarot cards translated into the deck of diamonds, which were considered even more valuable. Though throughout card history, there's been a variety of suits used. Germanic cards use acorns and bells instead of some of the other suits. The suit of scepters, which are also called different things in different traditions. They're called wands, they're called bastos or bastones in either Spanish or Italian, but basically they're wood, and it was found that the heat of wood, burning wood, reproduced the warmth of summer, so they became associated with the the element of fire. However, in modern playing cards, the trefoil or the three-leaf clover became the symbol, though we still call it the club. And the suit of cups is fairly universal, representing water and things emotional, and they were in later decks translated into hearts. And then swords, which in Spanish, the language of the country through which playing cards probably first entered Europe, is espadas. And so we, in modern cards, still call them spades, though the symbol is that of a small trowel or shovel, excuse me, which is used to dig within the earth. And so the swords or spades became symbols for earth. Now you'll find those switched in the Golden Dawn tradition and the traditions that stem from that.
Well, Christopher, can you explain to us how tarot works? I've been told that it's a way of interpreting what's occurring in the unconscious mind or the on the astral plane. Is that correct?
Well, very much so, and of course, Carl Jung, who had a fascination with tarot cards along with alchemy and astrology, felt that the major arcanum of the tarot represented archetypes, which are basically primal images or primal concepts. I do think that the major arcanum, if they do not have an older initiatic origin, that more than likely they were spawned from the allegorical studies that were being done in late medieval and early Renaissance times. And these are allegories or archetypes that are basically a symbolic language, and a symbol is something which represents something else. Now, in the Hermetic studies, we believe that all humans live in two environments, that we're very familiar with the environment that our physical body occupies and the physical senses which we have, and science is based on pretty much that which can be observed through the physical senses aided by instrumentation. But we also believe that our soul or the unconscious mind functions in a realm that is non-physical, that is interior to the physical, that moves at a vibratory rate higher than physical, which the ancients called astral, the word astral meaning of a star. And so it's in this subconscious realm where one can dive for information. And this is the place that most psychics, most intuitives go to get their information. So the process with tarot is called divination. And what takes place in a tarot card reading is really a form of psychokinesis, and that is the ability of mind to move matter. The reader is concentrating generally on a question. This could be something as broad as what surrounds this person over the next 12 months to will so-and-so ask me out on a dinner date? You can be as general or specific in a reading. Then the reader is going through the process of shuffling and cutting the cards. And what is believed to happen in that process is the desire for information of a specific type. That reader is tapping into their subconscious or into their higher self, or tapping into the astral plane where this information is available, past, present, and future. And then there is the process of that being translated through the mind, the subconscious mind, moving matter, arranging the cards so that they are laid out in a particular pattern. This is often unique to different readers. And when they're turned over, those symbols bring information up to the mind of the reader. The subconscious mind, or the soul, if we want to call it that, functions differently than our cerebral brain, which works in the concepts of time and language and measurement, whereas the unconscious mind communicates with us through either symbols or through feelings. And this is something that becomes very apparent in our dream states. So the reader, when these symbols come up, that oftentimes brings a level of awareness to the conscious mind of the reader about the particular question that is being discussed. And they may have accompanied that either the vocabulary that they have built up around the symbolism of that card, or they may have strong feelings. Some readers, upon looking at an image or tapping into the individual's lifeline, may also start to get images or pictures as to how events will unfold.
Christopher, can you help us to understand when it's more appropriate to use one system or tool than another? So when, for example, is it best to use tarot versus astrology,
That's actually a
if it
really
is?
great question. And I think an astrological chart is, and of course I have perhaps a biased opinion since that is a field I work in, but I think the astrological chart is perhaps the most important tool. I like to think of it as the operating manual, which is sent separately from the baby. And by having the astrological chart, we have a map of our consciousness, of who we are, our spiritual DNA. And there's little that is, I think, more worthy of one's constant contemplation and study in life than that. The advantage of the astrological chart is that when one does progressions, majors, minors, transits, they can very much identify the specific periods for timing of events, trends in one's life. That is something that is much harder to do with tarot cards, unless one has built up a system around the cards which they feel is very accurate in terms of determining dates. Otherwise, the cards don't necessarily always indicate that. Now, one thing that cards can do, which a chart cannot do, is in working with an individual's chart, one is very limited in terms of the information that they can bring up concerning that person's children, their spouse, their grandparents, their parents, their siblings. You can derive information, but it is going to be somewhat limited, whereas in a divinatory practice such as cards, questions can be asked of any nature, and therefore tarot cards can be very useful in terms of finding out that information that impacts an individual but is external to that individual. The tarot cards, I feel, sometimes can give a close-up view or tell a more specific story than one might gain from the chart. And in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, astrology is spoken of as being the gold key, and the tarot, the silver key. And the tarot are the symbols of astrological forces. So among the 22 major arcanum, we have pictured the energies of the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 10 planets. On the 12 court cards, those can correspond to the 12 compartments in the chart, but they can also correspond to 12 very specific personality types, which are governed by the signs of the zodiac. Now, there are differences. Most tarot readers say there are 40 minor arcanum. Zane asserts that there are 36 minors and 4 tens. And in astrology, there are what are known as the 36 decanets. And so the minor arcanums each correspond to a 10-degree section of the zodiac, which has its own pictured constellation. So in this particular system, which is a synthesis of the universe and based on an astrological language, excuse me, the more the reader knows about astrology, the more they're able to tap into that symbolism, that vocabulary in their readings. In the Waite tradition and the Golden Dawn tradition, which is actually where I began my studies until I was 17 and had a very powerful dream that led me to the Brotherhood of Light, it's based less on an astrological system and more on a Kabbalistic system, which is a 12th century Sephardic tradition coming out of Spain and based on the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. So there are different ways in which one can approach the tarot, be it through Kabbalistic or Hermetic systems.
And how frequently do you use tarot, Christopher, in your work?
Well, I use tarot generally 5 days a week because it is included among the tools that I use when I do readings for clients. Now, in terms of myself, when I was a teenager and when I was first studying this, I began my studies at age 13, and it started off through actually a schoolmate of mine. My friend Lonnie gave me a deck of cards. It was the Waite deck. I became immediately fascinated by these archetypal symbolism and began studying it and doing readings for friends. And as part of my study, I would also do readings more frequently for myself. Now, I may perhaps use them for myself just a few times a year when I have very specific questions, but I do use them with great frequency for other people.
When you've used them for yourself, Christopher, do you find that they've been accurate?
I do. And I started off, I must say, I brought a discipline to my practice at a very early age. And when I would do readings for myself, I would keep a journal in which I'd write down the nature of the question, the date, the type of spread that was being used, the cards that came up, and then a brief interpretation and a synopsis. And that way I could later go back and analyze the reading from the perspective of, is this how events unfolded? And if not, what was the reason for that? Was the reason due to the fact of my interpretation, or were the cards saying something quite different? One of the challenges in doing readings for oneself is it engages us in a state of subjectivity, whereas quite often when one, as you or your colleagues there know, when you are reading for complete strangers, you are in a state of objectivity and might say the things that pop into your mind, no matter how far-fetched they are, just because there are not biases in place. And it's sometimes out of the most outlandish or far-fetched things that very interesting information comes through. When one does readings for themselves, it's much harder to move into a state of objectivity because one knows certain things about their life, their trends, and one may have biases or expectations of how they would like the future to unfold. And that can come in and color a reading when it's being done. The same thing happens if one does readings for, family or close friends. The knowledge that they have about those individuals may color their interpretation because some of the more far-fetched things, even though it pops into their consciousness, they might not say so because it doesn't fit into the schematic. It doesn't fit into what they understand of that person or their life. So this is something in any form of divination, regardless of the tool that's used. Developing that objectivity is so very important.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I remember when I used tarot about the end of a relationship, I would twist the interpretation to get the answer I wanted rather than the truth. And I found that, well, looking back, the cards do tell the truth.
And that's a good reason to write them down because you can go back and you can see the little tricks that your mind may have played at that time. And that topic is very important, Stephen. When I sit down to do a session with someone, that is the thing that stands out in my mind most. I start off by entering very briefly but intensely into a prayerful state that I ask that I can receive the truth for this individual and to be able to communicate it to them in a way in which it is helpful to them. Because sometimes we can tell people the truth and it may be injurious or they may not know how to handle it. So it's important to even set up a session with that particular vibration or that particular intention when you go to do a reading, wanting the truth and wanting above all to be able to be helpful to someone. Because in any type of reading that we participate in, we are spiritual counselors, and persons come to us primarily because they are experiencing a pain of some type. And all of our jobs are to, in some way, help alleviate the suffering of others by being able to provide insights or strategies or coping skills to be able to deal with the different traumas and difficulties that our lives bring to us.
Do you ever use both the astrology and tarot in a session, Christopher?
I do. Normally, when I do a session, I like to keep them separated because they do really access very different skills, very different talents. I do find the process of astrological interpretation to sort of stimulate a different part of my brain or psyche than the process of divination. And doing astrological readings can be very electrical. They can be very cerebrally energizing. Divinatory readings can sometimes, depending on the type of ESP one has developed or that one has naturally. For example, I have very strong feeling extrasensory perception, for which the advantage of that is one can be sensitive to and feel empathetically what is going on with another person. Disadvantage of that is that when one is done, it's much harder to tune out of the situation, that one tends to be vibrationally still connected. So it's sometimes hard to slip back and forth between these different techniques of getting information from the higher mind. And with some people, I will combine them, where there may be a situation where somebody needs to get more detail on something that has shown up in a chart, and I may lay out the cards to try and use those symbols to provide a clearer unfolding of information.
I want to ask you, Christopher, a little more about the major arcana because I was told when I've read that the major arcana represent the fool's journey, that fool being the purity and innocence or naivety of spirit entering the material world, the physical plane, and journeying to evolve. Do you see in the major arcana an evolution?
Very much so. I'm not only fascinated by the studies of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, but also the modern works of such authors as Carl Jung and especially Joseph Campbell. So some may call it the fool's journey. Joseph Campbell might call it the hero's journey because it does tell that story. And in Hermeticism, in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, we might call this the journey of the soul, which is the cycle of necessity, the soul's involution into matter, and then that journey that consciousness makes back again towards spirit, which are considered to be the different steps of initiation. So regardless of the language we use, we're all probably talking about the same thing, that the major arcanum are telling this story of the soul's journey through matter and its peregrinations towards self-realization or spiritual realization. And there are a variety of experiences that happen along that. And in Campbell's book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, he really develops strategies for interpreting world mythologies. And the archetypes of the major arcanum of the Tarot would certainly fall under that system of interpretation.
Well, Christopher, we're going to take a short commercial break, and then after that, I'd like to ask you about some of the specific cards in the major arcana so that you can explain to us what they symbolize and the lessons and archetypes involved.
Great.
We'll be back shortly.
All right, I'll be here.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Ask about
Well, Christopher, I
any of them.
want to ask you about some of the major arcana cards. We often think of tarot and think of the devil card appearing or the death card appearing. And I know that the meaning of those cards is not as scary necessarily or as straightforward as somebody might presume. Could you explain to us a little bit about the death card to begin with?
I think that's an excellent choice. And excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. One of the things that's important to take into consideration, I I feel, is always the culture and the environment in which something is born. And out of the late medieval period, there were incredible exchanges of thought going on. This was primarily brought about because in Europe there were major sites of pilgrimage. And people would travel from one place to another. They would receive at those sites a sort of a certificate of their visiting a particularly holy shrine or relic. And these were the predecessors of today's holy cards. Quite often they were woodblock prints. And it's out of this tradition that the techniques of card printing came about in late medieval and early Renaissance times. And the tarot cards, the major arcanum, being allegories. One of the allegories, keep in mind that with pilgrimage, one of the other things that was being spread besides great ideas and trade goods is, bubonic plague, influenza, and other things. So out of medieval Europe, we had a whole tradition that took place known as the Danse Macabre. And this was primarily people's dealing with times in the culture where, through these pandemics, there was immense loss of life. I believe up to a third of the population was decimated at different times in Europe. So it was part of the coping skill of that. So the death card can, yes, indicate death, but the death card also can mean a death of many different things, whether it's the death of the ego, whether it's a death of particular conditions in one's life, or in certain decks, the skeleton, which represents the figure of death, is prefigured by a rainbow, which is the symbol of new life. So out of every decaying organism comes food for another organism. And this is the process of rebirth or continued life, or being able to take an experience and transform that into something new in our lives. So the death card comes out of that that medieval imagery that was so present in the consciousness at that time. The devil, on the other hand, too, is a concept out of Christianity. And in the late 15th century, when these trionfi were being designed primarily within the courts of northern Italy, what we have to keep in mind is there was another cultural phenomena going on, which was the Hermetic Reformation. So often we think of European history as being marked by the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther and his influences and the great schism that came about in Christianity in the 16th century. But in the prior century, there was this Hermetic Reformation going on that was at the vanguard were philosophers such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. And what they were trying to do was, in some ways, reconcile these pagan philosophers, the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, of Aristotle, of Plato, of Socrates, of Pythagoras, to the current Christian tradition. Now, in all of those previous, they were called pagan traditions. I don't like to use that word because paganus means something equivalent to a country bumpkin. But I like to call them the pre-Christian traditions. And in these pre-Christian traditions, there were also symbols or archetypes of different types of demons or devils, going as far back as Zoroastrianism, who brought into the concept of Hasatan, who became Satan, or our embodiment of evil in Christianity. So, for example, the devil card can represent those qualities which are demonic. I think that in human consciousness, they express of selfishness and self-centeredness, the desire to gain something at the expense of others. So in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, the Zen tradition, that card 15 corresponds to the planet Saturn, which governs those urges within the soul. So some of the more horrific images also represent experiences we all go through. When you think of the demons, we all wrestle with our own dark night of the soul or our own demons at different periods or phases in our life. And death is something that rarely do any of us escape: the loss of friends, our spouses, our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. in the course of life. And I hear it's the one experience we'll all have in common. So these are things that are naturally a part of our life, although the images can for some bring up dread or concern. Being able to face those horrific images as well as those experiences as they arise in our life is a very important coping skill.
I want to ask you, Christopher, if you have a favorite card.
Oh, that's a hard one. I do like Arcanum 7, which in some decks is called the Chariot. In the Brotherhood of Light deck, it's called the Conqueror. And that is one of my favorite cards. It is a man standing in a chariot that's being pulled forward by two sphinxes, a light and dark sphinx. There's a starry canopy above him. It's held up by four pillars, which represent the four pillars of the universe, or the four fixed signs of the zodiac that comprise the Sphinx: the Leo, fixed fire; Taurus, fixed earth; Aquarius, fixed air, the head of the man; and Scorpio, the wings of the eagle, which is fixed water. And on the front of the chariot is a uraeus, a winged orb, which represents the flight of the soul through time and space. So this card to me represents that sense of the story of the fool's journey or the hero's journey or the path of initiation, the soul moving through this life. The light and dark sphinxes represent the periods of fortune and adversity that each of us encounters. And he holds a scepter, which in the Brotherhood of Light deck is a cube, a square representing the physical plane, on top of which is a circle, the realm of spirit, and then a triangle, the realm of mind, showing that mind can extend into both realms, understanding the realms of spirit and understanding the material realms. So
And
it's a
Christopher,
card
when
of
these
victory.
symbols are used in architecture, for example, or in other
Yes,
ways in our societies, do they have a similar significance?
they do. In fact, all of tarot cards are based on the language of symbolism, which is the way we access unconscious information. And geometric symbols are one of the numeric and geometric symbols are one of the oldest forms of universal symbolism. We have personal symbols and universal symbols. Personal symbols are the things of depth psychology and the things of our dream substance, whereas universal symbols are those symbols that are archetypal in nature, and they're considered to be things that could be interpreted, and regardless of your ethnicity or culture, or regardless of the time of human occupancy on the earth. That these are things that are universally and easily understood. So the Tarot Arcanum were written in this language of universal symbolism, and that's why I think they hold such an allure and fascination and profound meaning for so many people. And nowadays, as I mentioned at the beginning of our session, back at the turn of the 20th century, there were basically only a couple of decks available. There was the Waite deck, and there was the Brotherhood of Light deck, and then Manly Hall's deck came into existence as well. And since that time, since the 1970s, hundreds of decks have been brought into production. Almost every artist from Dali on has efforted to work within this incredible archetypal material. And so there's so much available for students of art, for students of metaphysics or occultism, students of the Tarot. There's just a wealth of imagery out there, including I've seen a deck that's based on the hagiography of Catholic saints.
But do you feel that as people have developed all of these decks, Christopher, that some of them have lost their purity, the purity of the symbolism, the accuracy?
Yes, to some degree, but I think life is about interpretation, and in a sense, we move from universal symbols to more personal symbols. Most tarot imagery is fixed around the time of the Tarot of Marseille, and the order in which the cards follow pretty much follows that order. Some of the earliest Italian trionfi were unnumbered, so it was sort of considered common knowledge in terms of what numerical order they fell in. And you'll find some differences between, let's say, the White deck and the Brotherhood of Light deck in terms of the ordering of the cards. And specific Arcanums 8 and 11 are reversed in those decks.
There are theories as well, Christopher, that there are cards missing from the major arcana. Have you heard that?
I've heard that as well, and in the latter 19th century, in a book called The Light of Egypt, there was discussed 30 cards called the Tablets of Aeth, which were considered to be the esoteric tarot, or the images that were missing from that. And with those 30 cards, it would bring the tarot deck up to the divine number of 108, which I believe is 12 times 9, and also the number that's used in malas or japas, the prayer beads in Hinduism and Buddhism.
It always amazes me, Christopher, that people in general don't realize how powerful these systems are, that people don't realize how accurate in-depth astrology is, and how these metaphysical systems, the Kabbalah, Tree of Life, Tarot, numerology, astrology, the Hebrew alphabet, they're all correlated, even to tones and colors.
And the 19th century occultists, especially someone like Eliphas Levi, efforted to try and bring all of those together. And so the systems that succeed his are oftentimes called the occult tarot, because they've efforted to bring together the concepts of the different symbol sets, the symbol set of the Hebrew alphabet, of the astrological symbols, of numeric symbolism, and they all become, those symbols are all different ways that readers access the information that they're looking for and pull in their interpretations. And back to your statement about how all of these tools can be so useful, and part of it is too, it depends on in whose hands they fall. And there are people out there that can be very skilled with them, and there are other people who may have less skill, and that can always end up impacting the lay public that comes in contact with those tools.
Well, Christopher, it's been an incredible interview as always. I can't believe the time's gone already. I could talk to you forever, but I want
Well,
to
it's
thank
certainly
you
a
for joining
subject I
us. It
could
was
talk on
fascinating.
forever, but I thank you for having me here again this evening.
You're welcome, Christopher. Before you go, Christopher, I mentioned to our listeners that your personal website is stellarwisdom.com. I know that you teach a lot as well. Could you tell us how people can find out more about your teaching and your services?
Yes, the easiest way is to go to light.org, light.org, and to access classes. There are archived classes on www.churchoflight.tv, and I will be starting to teach an online tarot class again beginning, I believe it is Thursday, September 6th, about 6 months from now. So those are ways that people can contact me or contact the classes, and there are archived classes available for watching.
Wonderful. I know that they're incredible quality as well, Christopher, and thank you for everything that you do and for being with us this evening.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers, get access, psychic access, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.
More than likely, playing cards, especially Islamic playing cards, came into Spain during the 800 years of Islamic rule there. Now, the Tarot Arcanum, the Trionfi, as the Italians called them, appear to have come in later, and the oldest examples of them date from late medieval to early Renaissance period, and the oldest examples show up in northern Italy, around the areas of Florence and Ferrara, where these were being designed. And somewhere along the lines, these triumphs, these tarocchi, became combined with the decks of playing cards, which were 56 in number, and the 22 major arcanum became added to that, creating a 78 card.
Well, Christopher, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, Christopher. You're somebody that we really wanted to have back. And I know that we talked about astrology in quite some detail last time, but we're all poised to hear what you have to share with us about tarot. And really, Christopher, my first question on tarot is if you could tell us what you know about the beginnings or origins of tarot.
Well, Stephen, that may take all evening, but I'll certainly start with that, and you can stop me at any point. We probably need to best start with the word. Tarot entered English from the French. However, it comes from the Italian, tarocchi, and that is plural for tarocco, which is of unknown origin. The other thing that the tarot cards were called in Italian were trionfi, or triumphs, which translated into English as trumps, which is a word we still hear in card playing today. Now, there is a lot of confusion around the origins of the tarot. So there are folkloric interpretations. There are also interpretations that follow a history or a paper trail. And one of the folkloric traditions, and I'll talk about this also a little bit later, is out of the Brotherhood of Light tradition. It was believed that the tarot images were the bas-reliefs in a initiatory temple, and that initiates were brought before these as part of their induction and taught specific lessons about them. Though tracing that along the lines of history or paper trail is difficult. That's something that really doesn't pop up until the 18th century. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of tarot from what we know histek. So that is the history of this. Now, I mentioned that in the Brotherhood of Light tradition, this was believed to be the images tied in with initiation. And this comes from actually a document that appears in Europe in the late 18th century, around the 1780s. And the author of this is uncertain. It was attributed to Iamblichus, who was a Neoplatonist of the 5th century. And he did write on the mysteries and initiation, though this particular document does not necessarily follow his style, but it comes out of a European tradition at that time of what was Egyptian, Rosicrucian, and Freemasonic traditions. And so this document appears, which historically, and where this becomes a little confusing, is that it appears that tarot cards were actually a combination of two different decks. The oldest playing cards that have been found were discovered in 1939 by Leo R.A. Meyer, who was a professor of archaeology and Islamic art at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And he was at the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, where he discovered this either 12th or 13th century deck of cards with recognizable symbols on them. Now, as far as we know, cards came into Europe through the possibility of one or two pathways, either through the European contact with the Near East during the Crusades, or